right, let's dive right into this explainer with what has to be one of the absolute most bizarre and fascinating historical moments ever recorded. We are going all the way back to 480 BC. Imagine a powerful king getting so unbelievably furious at a literal body of water that he sentences the ocean itself to 300 lashes. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's just an old myth, right? But I assure you, it's not. This highly public, incredibly official whipping of a stormy sea actually happened, and it tells us so much about power, ego, and human nature. Just picture being one of those soldiers for a second. You're standing on this rocky, windswept shore in the middle of a massive thunderstorm, and your commanding officer tells you to crack a heavy whip directly into the crashing waves. It's totally absurd, but to understand exactly why they were physically attacking the water, we really have to look at the guy who gave the order. Meet Xerxes I. And he wasn't just a king, guys. His official title was literally the King of Kings. At this point in history, he ruled the absolute greatest, most expansive empire on the face of the earth. We're talking a massive Persian empire stretching all the way from Egypt to India. His wealth and military might were completely unrivaled. So, here is the crucial point to keep in mind: the extreme contrast in his power. On land, the man possessed absolute, unquestioned authority. When he spoke, millions obeyed, no questions asked. But elemental power? Controlling the weather? Zero. Zilch. And for a guy who was essentially treated as a living, breathing god, being told no by a thunderstorm is a very, very bitter pill to swallow. But why was he even dealing with the ocean in the first place? Well, it all comes down to the Hellespont. It's this incredibly narrow, totally treacherous strait separating Asia from Europe. Xerxes desperately needed to cross this specific stretch of water to launch his grand, long-planned invasion of Greece. He couldn't just walk around it. His entire army had to go right across it. Now, since they obviously didn't have modern suspension bridges back then, he commanded his engineers to literally build one out of ships. The steps were monumental. First, they had to chain hundreds of massive boats together, side by side, right across the churning strait. Then, they laid down heavy timber to build two massive pontoon bridges over those boats. This agonizing process took months of back-breaking labor and, honestly, incredible engineering precision. But as you probably guessed, nature had other plans. Literally, right as this massive project was finished, a violent, terrible storm rolled in. In a single, chaotic night of crashing waves, lightning, and howling winds, both of these incredible bridges were completely and utterly destroyed. Months of careful, painstaking work, totally wiped out by the weather in mere hours. Which brings us to a super fascinating psychological question for this explainer. How exactly does a living god react when nature disobeys? Really think about it. What happens when a man who has quite literally never been told no in his entire life is suddenly and violently defied by the elements? Well, most rulers would probably just cut their losses or, sigh and order the bridges rebuilt, but not Xerxes. Instead of calmly assessing the situation, Xerxes grew biblically furious. He didn't view the storm as just weather. He saw it as a personal insult. It was an act of blatant insubordination. So, doing what he evidently thought any rational world leader would do, he didn't just get mad. He officially declared full-blown war on the sea itself. His very first order of business, he commanded his elite troops to march right up to the water's edge and physically whip the Hellespont 300 times. On top of that, he ordered them to literally shout insults at the water. And we actually know this because the ancient Greek historian Herodotus recorded the whole event, noting that the insults were, let's just say, highly impolite and deeply disrespectful toward the ocean. But apparently just whipping the water wasn't enough. Moving on to the next phase of his punishment, Xerxes ordered his men to heave massive, incredibly heavy iron chains right off the cliffs and straight into the violent waves below. The purpose here was to literally and symbolically imprison the sea for having the sheer audacity to break his bridges. You have to imagine these heavily armored soldiers struggling to drag enormous chains directly into the crashing surf. But unfortunately for the actual human beings involved, his wrath wasn't just limited to the water. To ensure total compliance and really send a message, he actually had the original bridge engineers executed. He was demanding absolute submission, not just from the weather, but from literally everyone and everything around him. But here is the darkly comedic truth of this entire historical record. The sea did not apologize. The ocean did not repent. It definitely didn't care, and frankly, it never has. You can whip the waves all day long, you can shout at the clouds, you can throw iron chains into the deep, but at the end of the day, water is just going to be water. However, the truly terrifying reality of absolute power is that his massive imperial temper tantrum kind of worked. Well, it worked for his own psychology anyway. Xerxes felt better. He vented his fury, he asserted his dominance over nature in front of his terrified subjects, felt totally satisfied, and immediately ordered a new batch of engineers to build new bridges across the strait. And you know what? This time, the massive bridges held. Now, whether the sea learned its lesson or the new engineers were just deeply, deeply motivated by the terrifying fate of the previous ones, the structure stood firm. This allowed an absolutely overwhelming force, we're talking over 100,000 Persian soldiers, to safely march across those chained boats. Against all odds, the man's sheer will literally bridged continents. Bathed in the brilliant light of sunrise, Xerxes sat proud on horseback, watching his colossal, seemingly unstoppable army finally march off those pontoon bridges and step foot right onto European soil. Because he stubbornly refused to let a massive storm, or frankly basic common sense, stop him, the bloody invasion of Greece officially kicked off. That crossing led directly to some of the most famous and brutal battles in human history, including that legendary clash at Thermopylae against King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. Now, did his war against the sea actually help him win his war against the Greeks? We're definitely going to explore exactly how that massive invasion turned out in a future explainer for our Cursed Throne series. But this incredibly bizarre event leaves us with a final provocative thought today. Absolute power might let you whip the ocean into submission, but every throne has a price and every crown leaves a stain. To find out the true cost of Xerxes' hubris, make sure to subscribe and join us next time.